观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。今天上午我们打开各大西方主流媒体的新闻网站，无论是《华尔街日报》、《纽约时报》还是英国的《金融时报》，在头版头条都是这样一张照片，那就是拜登于周三亲自飞抵了以色列，并且明确表明立场，继续支持以色列，认为巴勒斯坦的医院爆炸事件的幕后黑手另有其人，并不是以色列军方干的。现在以色列和巴勒斯坦则是互相指责是对方所为。周三，拜登对以色列总理内塔尼亚胡说，根据美国国防部向我提供的数据，这是其他团体做的，并不是你。这句话也被各大媒体作为头条报道，表明了美国此刻的立场。目前为止，爆炸已造成471人死亡。而与此同时，周三，俄罗斯总统普京则来到了中国，出席了习近平主持的第3届“一带一路”高峰论坛，展示习近平要重启“一带一路”的雄心。这也是乌克兰战争开始之后，普京首次访问中国。这两场截然不同的出访，显示了全球格局的全新局面，并且因为以色列与哈马斯的战争，令西方与俄罗斯和中国之间的分歧日益扩大。这些分歧不仅在于谁应该为暴力升级负责，它还涉及对支撑全球规则的不同观点，以及谁来定义这些规则。分析师表示，这是地缘政治澄清的又一个时刻，就像乌克兰战争一样，各国必须自我定位。俄罗斯和中国拒绝谴责哈马斯，中俄批评以色列对待巴勒斯坦人的方式，特别是切断加沙供水和供电的决定，以及强调那里的平民死亡人数。而巴勒斯坦人和普通阿拉伯人的激烈反应，则使拜登的访问变得尴尬，美国也更难以充当中间人的角色。今年，中国则努力在伊朗和沙特阿拉伯之间周旋，实现和解，表明中国想要扩大在中东影响力的野心。同时，俄罗斯和中国不愿意指责哈马斯，并且努力将自己与巴勒斯坦的事业联系在一起，这正迎合了所谓全球南方的广泛情绪。他们认为，鼓励以色列犹太人在巴勒斯坦的土地上定居，孤立230万加沙人民，是在推行殖民主义政策。全球智库的一位欧亚项目负责人表示，全球南方现在是西方与中俄之间新竞争的重要领域。在中国的一带一路项目启动10年之后，周三，习近平在北京举办了10周年庆典，并且标志着这一项目的重新启动。这是习近平标志性的外交政策项目。北京希望在被指责了多年之后，为一带一路注入新的活力。习近平在北京人民大会堂发表主旨演讲时，将中国定位为更具包容性的全球新秩序的领导者，并且承诺中国的崛起将使所有想要参与的国家受益。习近平说，我们不愿意搞意识形态对抗，不搞地缘政治竞争，也不搞政治集团。他提出了一带一路新的未来发展方向，称未来几年一带一路将会更加符合中国作为全球南方催化剂的雄心，实现可持续发展，而不是所谓的西方新殖民主义。中国过去的大型项目现在正在让位于规模更小、更有针对性的中小型交易，比如说清洁能源和医疗保健等领域。同时，在中国大型政策性银行缩减贷款之后，越来越多的中国银行开始与西方银行和多边贷款机构进行合作，向发展中国家提供融资。有迹象表明，在疫情之后，一带一路正在恢复一些势头。美国智库美国研究所发布的全球中国项目统计数据显示，2023年前6个月，中国企业签署了价值总计400亿美元的一带一路相关建设和投资协议。如果保持这种活跃速度，今年达成的交易将超过2022年达成的680亿美元的项目。不过，在疫情之前，一带一路的年度支出通常会超过1000亿美元。密切跟踪该项目的分析师表示，在经历了最近的各方质疑之后，北京在寻求更加严格的计划，这可意味着一带一路倡议可能不会很快恢复到之前的规模。另外一个不确定性是，在斯里兰卡和赞比亚等一带一路借款国出现债务危机之后，各国是否仍然渴望参与。习近平于2013年首次提出一带一路倡议，向世界承诺将会有大量由中国资金资助、由中国人亲手建设的公路、铁路、港口和能源项目。他称这一雄心勃勃的计划是一个世纪工程，最终目标是将亚洲 与欧洲、非洲和拉丁美洲更加紧密地联系起来。对于受到资助的发展中国家来说，一带一路提供了基础设施改造，同时一些富裕的国家也看到了翻新老化设施，并且与世界第2大经济体进行贸易的机会。而对于中国来说，凯头宏观的中国经济主管表示，主要好处是地缘政治，一种收买朋友和影响力的方式。现在10年过去了，这一倡议饱受压力，习近平面临的挑战是对该项目的怀疑情绪仍然有所增加，尤其是在西方国家中，他们已经对自己对中国经济的过度依赖感到不安。意大利是七国集团发达经济体中唯一签约“一带一路”的成员，目前正在寻求退出。同样，希腊在接受“一带一路”倡议后，现在也试图与中国保持距离。中国国有的航运公司中远集团于2016年获得了希腊比雷埃夫斯港的多数股权，计划将其打造成中国与欧洲贸易的重要门户。习近平曾经一度称该港口为“一带一路”在欧洲的龙头，但是现在随着公众和政界对中国投资的热情降温，希腊官员最近游说美国政府投资希腊造船厂，以限制中国的立足点。习近平希望这一次重启“一带一路”能够激发人们对“一带一路”新的兴趣，特别是那些渴望基础设施的发展中经济体。中国国务院本月发布了一份文件，谈到了参与“一带一路”倡议的经济利益，包括增加与中国的贸易和投资。国务院列出了一些重大项目，例如连接老挝和中国云南的铁路，以及较小规模的项目，比如说鲁班工坊。鲁班工坊可以向发展中国家教授包括机器人技术在内的技术科目。伦敦 ODI 智库的中国专家表示，发展中国家仍然广泛接受中国提出的经济发展建议，尽管一些借款人出现了债务危机，他们只是对项目的融资方式变得更加谨慎一些。这些国家并不像欧洲或者美国那样关心中国的崛起，对他们来说，这只是另一个可以为他们提供资源的国家。一些分析师表示，一带一路重启的一个重要部分是中国如何为一带一路贷款融资。波士顿大学的数据显示，随着借款人陷入债务困境，中国进出口银行和国家开发银行等大型贷方的贷款近年来有所缩减，一些贷款机构则加入了外国贷款机构的行列。2021年，中国银行和中国工商银行加入了渣打银行、花旗银行等组成的财团，一起为伊拉克天然气田的开发提供了3.6亿美元的贷款。分析师表示，在经历了债务危机带来的坏账之苦之后，北京实际上正在将风险管理外包给西方银行，努力降低“一带一路”的风险。习近平在周3的讲话中表示，尽管当前中国经济面临困难，北京仍然承诺向“一带一路”的国家提供3500亿元人民币的财政支持。而在习近平讲话之后，俄罗斯领导人普京也受邀直接在习近平之后发表讲话。他当然是赞扬了“一带一路”项目。在合照中，我们也可以看到普京站在习近平的身边，位于整个合照的中心位置。普京的突出地位以及20多位发展中国家领导人的出席，但是却几乎没有欧盟国家的代表，只有匈牙利总理欧尔班是唯一出席会议的欧盟国家领导人。而在2019年，希腊和意大利领导人都曾经出席。这一现象反映出自10年前习近平首次提出这一想法以来，地缘政治路线的日益分裂。在俄罗斯面临与西方的经济孤立之际，普京却来到北京，邀请“一带一路”国家参与开发北方海上航道。该航道从俄罗斯西北部穿过北极，直至白令海峡。该航线缩短了到中国的航运距离，并且避开了苏伊士运河和马六甲海峡的咽喉要道。普京称，俄罗斯可以随时为破冰船提供可靠的导航、通信和补给。据俄罗斯官方媒体报道，普京还告诉习近平，在当前困难的情况下，中俄更加应该密切协调外交政策。普京此行虽然尚未与中国达成任何新的经济协议，但这已经为他带来了外交红利，令普京展现出尽管西方国家努力地孤立他，但他还是在北京会见了中国以及其他亚洲领导人。俄罗斯远东联邦大学国际关系教授卢金表示，本周“一带一路”论坛清楚地表明，俄罗斯仍然是一个拥有大量资本的大国，远没有被孤立。亚洲以及整个南方国家都清楚地表明，乌克兰战争不是他们关心的问题，他们对与中国和俄罗斯做生意更感兴趣。 在今年论坛的筹备过程中，中国已经将“一带一路”倡议与中西方竞争联系起来。中国政府本月早些时候发布的一份白皮书，针对美国限制向中国出售某些技术的努力，白皮书称，某些国家过度延伸国家安全理念，以去风险为名谋求脱钩，他们的行为给人类的长期发展设置了障碍。与这一说法相呼应的是，周三，习近平在演讲中批评西方谋求减少对中国经济的依赖。他说，如果把别人的发展视为自己的发展，人类的生活才会更好，发展会更快。就在他说话的前一天，本周二，美国商务部表示将会进一步收紧对中国购买先进芯片的限制，因为这些芯片可能会推动人工智能领域的突破。习近平则在周三的讲话中表示，尽管国家安全打压加剧，国际商业信心下降，但是中国经济对外国投资持开放态度，中国将取消制造业领域对外国投资的所有限制。这长期以来一直是寻求在中国进行生产的外国公司的一大痛处，但是尚未公布具体的细节。同时，为了使“一带一路”倡议更加的制度化、透明化，习近平还宣布为“一带一路”设立秘书处的计划。分析师表示，这一切都表明，只要习近平在位，这个项目就会一直存在。以上就是本期新风事件的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这期的热点深度来关注这几天成为话题的中国企业家们。首先是许家印，在上周日华尔街日报有一篇文章提到，许家印曾试图扭转恒大的颓势，但最终他还是失败了。这篇文章的重点是2021年的时候，陷入财务困境的中国恒大曾向中国政府官员求助，希望政府助其解决无力偿还巨额债务的问题。中国政府有关部门和监管机构是同意有条件的帮这家房地产巨头来化解风险。身为中国恒大创始人兼董事局主席的许家印当时就承诺将优先保障该公司预售给中国各地家庭的大量住宅的建设和完工。在公司总部遭抗议者围堵之后，中国恒大还承诺对购买了其理财产品的中国国内投资者进行全额的偿付。而在2年后的时间，也就是现在，据《华尔街日报》对中国恒大监管公司所做的分析，该公司约120万套预售房中仍有约80万套没有完工。中国恒大在合肥、郑州、成都等多个中国城市的一些住宅项目施工进度已经放缓或陷入停滞。在2023年的8月份，恒大理财产品停止兑付，再次是引起投资者的不满。由于许家印的失信违约，很多中国的民众是大感愤怒，他们前往中国恒大未完工的公寓楼盘和投资产品中投入的巨额资金血本无归，而中国政府在化解房地产市场乱局、恢复购房者对住房市场信心方面也因此面临着更大挑战。中国全国住房销售是每况愈下，而就连业内实力较强的开发商也是摇摇欲坠。进入到10月，另一家中国房地产巨头碧桂园也是陷入了流动性危机。该公司表示，因销售额骤降而无法支付国际债务。那中国媒体财新最新的报道就提到，据2名可靠人士向财新透露，碧桂园有一笔境外债应于9月17日付息。碧桂园未能在30天的宽限期满时向债券持有人支付总计约1540万美元的票面息，恐怕已属实质性的违约。在上个月，中国监管机构否决了中国恒大及其顾问煞费苦心制定的境外债重组以及业务重振计划。许家印也被警方监视居住，并因涉嫌犯罪接受调查，而这也令中国的恒大是乱上加乱。据《华尔街日报》早些时候的报道，有关部门也正在调查65岁的许家印是否在中国恒大未能完成并交付其预售项目之际，是企图将资产转移到国外。 那自2009年上市以来，中国恒大累计分红达到了733.86亿元。许家印夫妇常年控制了中国恒大70%左右的股权，累计可能会拿走超过500亿元人民币，那占比达到了68.54%。这几天中国的一家自媒体工作室就提到，许家印家族可能通过数量庞多的离岸公司编织一张巨网，用以控制旗下企业主体及豪宅的资产，部分可以被追踪的持有或曾持有的这些房地产，包括一处香港公寓房、3栋位于香港太平山顶的豪宅、一栋澳洲豪宅、一栋美国洛杉矶豪宅，以及一栋被誉为英国最贵的豪宅。但这些资产多以离岸公司或者代持的方式，一度隐藏了背后真正的所有者。那许家印的家族除了许家印本人之外，那还有他的前妻丁玉梅、大儿子许志健以及二儿子许腾鹤。在2008年的时候，许家印曾接受媒体采访时提到过自己的婚姻。他说：“别的我不敢说是公司第一，但我们夫妻的感情，不自夸地说，一直是恒大人学习的榜样。”然而，具有讽刺意味的是，在2023年的8月14日，中国恒大发布了一系列公告，丁玉梅被称为独立于本公司及其关联人士的第三方，并未如此前一般被列为许家印的配偶。这一个举动也被质疑为技术性离婚，丁玉梅或许已经成为了许家印的前妻。那这篇文章也提到，有媒体报道说，丁玉梅持有加拿大护照。丁玉梅至少是在7月下旬前得知内地有企业家因许家印被编控之后，随即买了机票离开了香港，去向当时是不为所知。但清流提到，丁玉梅持有外籍护照并非新鲜事，至少在10多年前，丁玉梅就已经持有加拿大护照。与此同时呢，许家印本人及其大儿子许志健也均持有香港的身份证，并且2023年的8月6日，丁玉梅短暂曾到访美国，当天入境美国，随即出境。根据记录，其上一次访问美国那还是在2019年。有的中国企业家已被依法采取强制措施，同时也有中国企业家决定和地方执法机关来一场硬碰硬的较量。在10月14日的时候，多益网络这个网络游戏公司在多平台发文，是公开质疑广州的公安机关执法不公。简单来说呢，就是多益公开抗议广州的公安局之前是举报职务侵占，经侦大队拒绝立案，那还被索贿，向上级进行复议之后仍未通过，无奈是公开发表情况说明。但3天之后，多益网络的董事长徐波就被冲锋枪特警以寻衅滋事罪给逮捕了。同时，公司还被拷贝保密文件、保密资料，且资料与案情无关。那强行拷贝的，过了好几个月，案情也是停滞不前，而只是限制董事长徐波的人身自由。到了10月18日，多益网络再次发文，第一句话就非常的震撼，说以前我也和你一样相信公安，直到老板遇到冲锋枪。多益网络的这篇发表在10月18日的声明也提到，我们曾经在发现腐败案前没有获得任何私利的情况下，因为信任警察、关爱警察，给广东警察基金捐款300万元。我们并不认为这会换来违法犯罪下的免罪免罚，但绝对没有想到会换来怀疑你莫须有的冤案陷害，寒心至极。在中国敢于和暴力机关这么公开的赤裸裸的正面针锋相对的公司应该是不多。多益网络的董事长徐波，网名叫做竹肘，也是一个现象级的人物。有介绍提到，徐波是初中文凭，24岁加盟网易公司，从事普通员工，一直做到游戏《梦幻西游》的游戏策划。2017年 IT 大佬收入排行榜上以285亿元资产位列第9。不过亿万富翁的徐波却鼓吹是一夫多妻反女权，微博长期挂着争美女生孩子的小广告。在徐波的眼中，年龄超标、近视、智商低于120与所有男友累计同居超过半年、养狗等都是扣分项，而英语水平极佳、皮肤极好、父母感情稳定、父亲是社会精英等则是加分项。徐波还鼓吹女性有才华，不如找个优秀男人嫁了，学母鸡下蛋多生娃。那徐波这一番在广州公安面前吃瘪画风是颇有点出乎大家的意料， 这里啊也就不展开说徐波这个人了，以后有机会的话再做多几期来说他的故事。那多益网络这么强硬的态度，也让大家对这场民营企业硬刚地方公安这件事非常期待。那有的中国企业家已被依法采取强制措施，有的中国企业家被限制自由出入境，那就有中国企业家成功润了出去。据说这2年在中国最倒霉的人是房子买了恒大的，还投资了一笔碧桂园，理财选了中植，电视看的是乐视，手机用的是金立，车子买的是威马汽车。这也是这几天在网上流传的一个杜撰的很火的笑话。事情源于恒大、碧桂园、中植、乐视、金立、威马这几家中国企业近年来是不断暴雷崩塌，深陷债务危机，老板被控制。而最新入列的就是这个电动车的初创公司威马。媒体在10月9日才刚刚引述中国全国企业破产重整案件信息网的消息报道说，威马汽车科技集团有限公司申请破产，上海市第3中级人民法院办理该案。而到了本周，有关威马创始人沈辉赴德国参加慕尼黑车展之后转机直飞美国纽约不回中国的消息也进一步的传播开来。根据中国媒体每日经济新闻在10月17日的报道，沈辉的友人透露沈辉的确已不在中国，在2023年的春节后未曾在公司公开露面，家人呢也是早就奔赴了美国。虽然沈辉在9月10日还曾在微博发文，而且至此他发的每条文章都显示他的位置在北京，但知情人士说沈辉的微博其实都有专人代笔，所以动态发布显示的位置都是在中国境内。因此有业内人士对上海证券报就解释和透露说，威马汽车没出海，而创始人沈辉则成功出海了。而沈辉作为老板走了，留下的是超过410亿元的投资和债务，被欠薪超过4个月的800余名员工，还有一众威马的车主。不过最新的消息是威马汽车辟谣创始人跑路海外的传闻。针对网传其这个创始人跑路海外一事陷入经营危机的中国造车的这个新势力威马汽车在微博上发文辟谣说公司的创始人近期工作重心以海外事项为主，不存在跑路的情况。此外，威马还说有关威马汽车申请破产的消息也不实，目前正在进行的是经上海第3中级人民法院受理的预重整阶段。威马解释预重整不同于破产重整，是在企业面临困境的早期阶段进行的自救行为，旨在通过重组债务进行引进战略投资人，避免破产，实现重生蜕变。威马说目前网络上流传的威马融资400亿等信息均为不实的信息，多数报道混淆了融资金额与债权以及债务金融。辟谣的声明还提到，目前公司核心岗位运营正常，关于11之后车机部分的 APP 使用出现异常状况，公司成立应急小组，在发现情况的48小时之内解决了相关问题，恢复正常使用。声明还说目前公司的重点包括售后服务、复工复产、出口业务、海外合作、国际融资以及引进战略投资人等事项已取得一定进展，会寻找合适的时机对外公布，并承诺公司将尽最大努力保障用户、员工、供应商、经销商及投资人的权益。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注六度简报网，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
I'd like to take this opportunity today to speak about the newly declassified pictures and videos shared by the department today that depict the PLA's sharp increase in coercive and risky operational behavior in the East and South China Seas. And in particular, I'd also like to discuss why it represents such a significant concern. Now, as many of you know, every year for over 20 years, the Department of Defense has released what we call the China Military Power Report, or the CMPR. It's an important document because it's the department's authoritative public assessment of the PLA and the role it plays in helping to realize Beijing's broader ambitions. This year's report will be out soon, and taken together with today's announcements, it represents the department's most comprehensive depiction to date of this highly concerning behavior by the PLA. Well, last year's CMPR noted that PLA fighter jets were increasingly engaging in coercive and risky operational behavior. This year's CMPR provides a much clearer estimate of that disturbing trend. Specifically, since the fall of 2021, we have seen more than 180 such incidents, more in the past 2 years than in the decade before that. That's nearly 200 cases where PLA operators have performed reckless maneuvers, or discharged chaff, or shot off flares, or approached too rapidly or too close to U.S. aircraft, all as part of trying to interfere with the ability of U.S. forces to operate safely in places where we and every country in the world have every right to be under international law. And when you take into account cases of coercive and risky PLA intercepts against other states, the number increases to nearly 300 cases against U.S., ally, and partner aircraft over the last 2 years. Now let me take a moment to explain why this matters so much from our perspective. For decades, the United States has operated in the region safely, responsibly, and in accordance with international law, and we will continue to do so. Our allies and partners welcome our military presence because it advances our shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. This vision, which Secretary Austin described at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, is characterized by respect for sovereignty, adherence to international law, belief in transparency and openness, freedom of commerce and navigation, equal rights for all states, and the resolution of disputes through peaceful means, not through coercion or conquest. And it's the peace and stability extending from this security environment that has provided the foundation for the region's shared prosperity. By contrast, the PLA's coercive and risky behavior, like the kind the department is highlighting today, seeks to intimidate and coerce members of the international community into giving up their rights under international law. It directly contradicts what the region wants for itself, and it can put lives at risk, the lives of our service members, the lives of our allies and partners' service members, and even the lives of PLA operators. The examples released by the department today may each look different, whether in terms of the distance between the lawfully operating U.S. asset and the PLA asset engaged in coercive and risky behavior, or in terms of how exactly the PLA asset behaves in any given interaction. But all of these examples we've released today underscore the coercive intent of the PLA by engaging in these behaviors, particularly in international airspace. And the bottom line is that, in many cases, this type of operational behavior can cause accidents, and dangerous accidents can lead to inadvertent conflict. In January of this year, for example, an American aircraft was flying in the skies above the South China Sea, safely, responsibly, and in accordance with international law, and hundreds of miles from land. A PLA jet fighter approached our asset at a speed of hundreds of miles per hour, clearly armed, and closing to just 30 feet away. In fact, once it was there, the PLA fighter jet lingered at that narrow proximity for more than 15 minutes. Just weeks before, INDOPACOM had publicly released a video of a similar incident. And for the PLA to engage in this coercive and risky behavior so soon after that incident, indeed for PLA operators to continue this behavior at all, points to what this year's CMPR will describe as, and I'm quoting directly here, a centralized and concerted campaign. Let me say that again. A centralized and concerted campaign to perform these risky behaviors in order to coerce a change in lawful U.S. operational activity and that of U.S. allies and partners. We've also witnessed PLA pilots deliberately interfere with and create turbulence for U.S. operators by flying in front of U.S. aircraft at close distances. Photos from an incident in January 2022 show a PLA fighter jet crossing in front of a lawfully operating U.S. asset at a distance of just 100 yards, forcing the U.S. pilot to fly through the PLA's wake. Again, this is at speeds of hundreds of miles an hour and at an altitude of tens of thousands of feet. And this is not a one-off occurrence. In May of this year, as many of you know, INDOPACOM released a video of a PLA aircraft speeding along a U.S. aircraft before cutting in front of it. You can even see the physical effects of the resulting turbulence on the aircraft and the crew. This is yet another disturbing sign of the PLA's coercive and risky operational behavior at a time when the PRC has declined our invitations to open lines of military-to-military communication at the senior-most levels. These images and videos speak for themselves. U.S. planes are operating safely, responsibly, and in accordance with international law. Indeed, the skill and professionalism of American service members should not be the only thing standing between PLA fighter pilots and a dangerous, even fatal accident. Yet, time after time, that is exactly what has prevented a disaster in the East and South China Seas. As Secretary Austin has said on numerous occasions, the PRC can and must end this behavior, full stop. For our part, the department will continue to raise awareness about the dangers of the PLA's coercive and risky operational behavior. We will also continue to seek open lines of military-to-military communication with the PLA at multiple levels, including the senior-most level, because we believe these channels are crucial for preventing competition from inadvertently veering into conflict. Finally, the United States will not be deterred or coerced. We will continue to fly, sail, and operate safely and responsibly wherever international law allows. Our forces have helped sustain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific for decades, and we will continue to do so every day. So I hope today's announcement can help increase understanding here in Washington, across the Indo-Pacific, and around the world about why the PLA's operational behavior is so concerning. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Admiral Aquilino before we open it up to questions.
Thanks, Dr. Ratner. Sabrina, good to see you. Thanks for inviting me to be here today. And to all of you in the audience, I've spoken to many of you, but not all of you, so I'm honored to be here, and I thank you for participating. Eli talked about the perspective and the challenges that exist as it applies to the PRC activity described in the report. I'm here to talk about these concerns from my perspective as the commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM. First, let me start by stating that the service members of Indo-PACOM, our uniformed members, our civilian warriors, every day operate in order to prevent conflict. That is, prevent conflict, not provoke it. Now, we do that in order to execute our functions and our missions, and that is to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. That free and open Indo-Pacific enables peace, prosperity, and stability for all the nations in the region. And we've done that for 8 decades. Indo-PACOM deters conflict by being ready every day, whether it's our warfighting capabilities, our operations, our relationships with our allies and partners, and our exercises. Let me point out that our joint force is highly trained, disciplined, and professional. Our air operations are planned, rehearsed, and executed safely every day. As the Joint Force Commander, I'm most concerned about the potential for accidents, the way Dr. Ratner explained them. And those accidents could lead to miscalculation. We must prevent these from happening in the theater. So let me be clear. Intercepts happen every day around the world. The vast majority are conducted safely and without incident. And there's no reasons for the intercepts with the PRC in the Indo-Pacific region to be any different. I'm here today because it's the operational commander's #1 responsibility to ensure the safety of our service members. And it's a responsibility I take very seriously. So highlighting these behaviors and ensuring that we can prevent them is a top priority. I want to thank you again for allowing me to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Just a quick note at the top, I'd ask that you keep your questions to this topic, and then we'll brief after for news of day. So with that, I'll go to AP, Tara Kopp.
Thanks for doing this. Admiral Aquilino, given the new conflict in the Middle East, how concerned are you that you do not or will not have the assets you need, given that there's now 2 carriers monitoring the Med? How are you able to continue to deter China if all of these assets need to go into potentially another central command conflict? And then for Dr. Ratner, given that there is also now a second conflict, have you been able to speak to any of your partners or allies about increasing production to get more 155, since now both Israel and Ukraine will need them?
So thanks. Let me start. First, it is incredibly sad to watch the actions of the terrorists in the Middle East. It's also sad to watch the illegitimate, illegal war in Ukraine. That's been initiated by the Russians. As it applies to the Indo-Pacific and my responsibilities, what I'll tell you is I haven't had one piece of equipment or force structure depart. The United States is a global power, and that means we can deliver effects and execute our deterrence responsibilities across the globe. I don't think any other nation can do that at this time, but the United States can. By the way, the Indo-Pacific Command has 2 aircraft carriers right now at sea as well, along with a large portion of the joint force executing deterrence missions in my theater.
And maybe I'll just follow up. I'm going to stay away from the questions about issues related to other theaters and discussions with our allies and partners. But what I will say about this question of what does the events in other parts of the world mean for our policy and strategy in the Indo-Pacific and as it relates to the PRC, which is that, look, we have a 2022 National Defense Strategy, which has described the PRC as the department's pacing challenge. That remains true today. We have a presidential budget request for the department that reflects that strategy, a strategy-driven budget. And we have been, in addition to those investments, developing new operational concepts relevant to the region. We have been developing a more mobile, distributed, lethal, and resilient force posture in the Indo-Pacific. We've had a banner year in that regard over the last 12 months, a lot of great work in concert with Indo-PACOM from Japan, the Philippines, down through Australia. And in the meantime, we have been deepening our alliances and partnerships in the region, and to a T, our key alliances and partnerships in the region are stronger than they have ever been. As a result of that activity, you have likely heard department leaders say repeatedly, we believe deterrence is real and deterrence is strong, and we're doing everything we can to keep it that way.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, though, is there a concern in the region that while having to engage in both Ukraine and Israel, there might be a reduced capability to meet whatever threat is faced by those same countries by China?
Like I said, we have been taking a number of steps to strengthen our commitment to the region, strengthen our deterrent to the region, and we will continue to do that.
Reuters?
Admiral, just similarly on that, have you seen any indications or any intel that the Chinese are looking at this period of not distraction, but just focus on the Middle East and Europe as an opening for a potential not invasion of Taiwan, but operations against the island? And Eli, how many of these 180 that you described are unsafe and or unprofessional? Because that's been the standard by which we have measured dangerous behaviors. So coercive and risky seems subjective, whereas unsafe and unprofessional is what we're used to as sort of a metric for what is dangerous and isn't.
Yeah, first, thanks. I'm certainly not going to discuss any intel that I've seen. What I'll say is historically, certainly all nations look at what's going on in the geopolitical space, in the military space, and I would expect there to be lessons learned. Indo-PACOM prepares every day to ensure we execute both of the missions the Secretary gave me. Number one, to prevent conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And number two, if mission one fails, be prepared to fight and win. So those actions go on each and every day in Indo-PACOM, and we would expect all nations to be watching these actions and then determining how that best fits into their future ways. That said, my forces are ready today.
So just in response to your question, look, we have a very specific set of criteria that we use to articulate and describe particular behaviors. That is classified. It should remain classified, and what we are presenting today is a set of activities that we believe exhibit observable behavior and that we have cataloged along the lines that I have described. And look, I understand the desire for exactly how many of these, what's the exact number. One is too many. All right, that's our view here at the department. What we have provided and will be on the Pentagon website, if it's not up already, will be 15 specific incidences cataloging over this period from the fall of 2021 through today, the most recent case in September, and every one of these is one too many.
Great. I'm going to go to Janie.
Thank you, sir. Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Russian President Putin summit will be held in Beijing. Also, North Korea and Russia's foreign ministers meeting in the Pyongyang tomorrow. How do you analyze the strength of military cooperation and solidarity between North Korea, China, and Russia?
Thank you. First, we watch very closely the cooperation, and certainly the concern from Indo-PACOM is the statement of a no-limits relationship between the PRC and Russia, the inability to denounce bad actions globally, and their increased cooperation exercises, and we watch it very closely. So, two authoritarian powers working that closely together is certainly concerning. Secondly, on North Korea and Russia, with the transfer of weapons and capabilities that you've seen and been written about in the media, is also of concern. So the region is gotten more dangerous, and we watch very closely.
Why do you think China refuses military talks with the United States? Reason why?
Yeah, you're going to have to ask my counterparts in China. As I've been on the record before, I've asked to speak with my counterparts, the Eastern and Southern Theater commanders now, going on 2.5 years. I have yet to have one of those requests accepted, and I look forward to speaking to my counterpart. I think developing that relationship would be critical to maintaining the peace and stability in the region.
Great. Warren?
The incidents you're talking about focus on intercepts in the air. I was wondering, are you seeing related action or a series of incidents in the maritime domain and an increase in that trend? I know there have been some incidents and some videos shared by DOD and others. Is there a similar trend you're seeing on the water?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that first and then pass it over to Admiral Aquilino. Absolutely, yes. This is part of a broader pattern of PLA behavior throughout the region, throughout domains and throughout geographies, that we're seeing this behavior on the water, in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. We're seeing it against allies and partners, not just the United States. We're seeing it on land against our Indian partners. So this is part of a much broader picture. What we wanted to do today was focus on this particular set, provide some information and some data in this particular issue that we think is dangerous, and one that Secretary Austin has spoken about directly, publicly, and privately with allies and partners, and frankly privately with PRC counterparts when he's had the opportunity to do that. But Long, if you want to talk about the broader regional picture. Yeah,
there's certainly incidents in the maritime that are concerning. We released one not long ago when the U.S. and Canada were transiting through the Taiwan Strait, and PLA ship cut directly in front of the United States ship. That's one example. There are more. I think the best I would say is if you look at what the Philippines have released most recently as it applies to utilizing fire hoses in an attempt to blocking their movement into Second Thomas Shoal, it's similar to the air domain.
Great. I'm going to go to Tom.
Admiral, is there any indication of communication between the U.S. and allied pilots and ship drivers and the Chinese? Or is it a one-way conversation or any conversation? And also, I know you can't get into intel, but is this being ordered by the highest levels of the Chinese government, or is this more a lower level kind of military thing going on here?
Yeah, I'd go to what Dr. Ratner talked about as a part of the report. I think the report assesses that this is a part of a strategy by the PRC. So that's point one. Point two, the first thing we do at all points in the operational space is attempt to communicate to ensure both parties understand what are we do, where are we, what are we doing, what's our intent, to ensure we can avoid any type of accident. That is always step one. Sometimes that communication happens, sometimes it doesn't. And I think there's video in some of those, or audio in the videos that articulate sometimes the responses that we get. There are expansive claims that are not in accordance with international law. But the United States always attempts, step one, to communicate and ensure we understand intent.
You say sometimes it's communications. Any sense, percentage, 20% of the time?
Yeah, I don't have the
Any sense?
percentage.
I'm going to go to Courtney. I saw your hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted a clarification on your answer to Idris, because I didn't understand. Are you saying that now it's classified whether something is unsafe or unprofessional?
No. What I was describing is the very specific criteria that we use around these, and some of the data is classified. In fact, what you are seeing today is the result of months and months of efforts to declassify this information and sanitize it for public release. So we don't think it's in our interest and in our national interest to get into very specific details about the nature of all of these incidents because of how our other countries may use that information. So we're not today prepared to go beyond the data which we're releasing here, but just to emphasize that we believe we're providing a significant amount of transparency into the event today.
Is that a policy that only relates to Indo-Pacific Command? Because I know for EUCOM, we've had Pat Ryder stand here at the podium and tell us that something that happened with the Russian aircraft was unsafe and unprofessional. So is that
And
only
we have done that on a case-by-case basis. The question here was about very specific summary data about all of the events, and we're not prepared to share that data today.
So just to be clear, that the 180 that you referenced that were, I think you said they were risky, is that?
Coercive.
Risky and what?
Coercive.
Coercive. That is, it's language that I think we've known for a long time, unsafe and unprofessional, and how that was a characterization that I think a lot of us are just familiar with, frankly. So I guess I'm having a hard time equating how to take that information that you're putting out today with how we have characterized these sorts of things in our reporting in the past. So are all of these things risky and coercive considered unsafe and unprofessional then as well?
I'm not going to get into additional labels.
Well, let me just say it. Let me take a shot at it,
Yeah.
Courtney. I think what I would say is when you get to unsafe and unprofessional, that's really concerning behavior, right? People's lives are at risk. What we've seen since 2001 is a set of actions that have brought airplanes much closer together than are comfortable for those in the cockpit. In other words, flying off my wing at 15 feet for 45 minutes has too much of a chance to lead to an accident. We've seen an increase in those close intercepts and activities in very close proximity to our airplanes since the fall of 2001. A subset of those 180 have been unsafe, unprofessional.
Great. We're going to take one more
Sorry,
question.
we can provide you with an articulation of the criteria that was used for these events today. We'll do that.
And I know our briefers have limited time, so I'm going to take one last question from Rio.
Yeah, thank you very much. The question to Dr. Ratner. Does the Pentagon encourage allies and partners to release the Chinese unsafe behavior to the public so that the public will get a better understanding of what the Chinese is doing?
I would say our position is that is their story to tell. Those are their sovereign decisions to make about releasing that information. I think from our perspective, we believe that transparency around this is important for better understanding about this behavior.
Yeah, I would say all those things you've heard about and publicized from other nations have been publicized from other nations. What I think they show is the linkage to what we're putting out today is this is not behavior just faced by the United States. This is behavior that many of our allies and partners are having to deal with in the region. And again, to Dr. Ratner's point, one accident is too many. We went through it in 2001, and certainly my intent as the operational commander is to do everything possible to ensure that we can protect our aircrew and that all nations should have the expectation of being able to operate safely in international airspace in the region. That's the rules-based international order that you hear us talk about so frequently.
It would be useful if you could give us some context into what China's auto industry looked like in the past, say maybe 10 years ago. How have things shifted in the recent years?
Yeah, there's some irony that today we talk about China's automotive industry as such a success story, because for decades, this was a real area of frustration for Chinese policymakers. I would go back further than just 10 years, just to say that since the late 1970s, the Chinese government has engaged with foreign automakers to try and attract foreign direct investment and boost its own domestic manufacturers. And the attractiveness of China for foreign automakers was that this was eventually going to become and has become the largest automotive market in the world. And for the Chinese government, of course, it was a question of attracting foreign technology. Over the years, then, this created sort of the foundation for the structure which lasted until very recently, where you had very successful joint ventures between typically state-owned enterprises and foreign companies. You know, think of GM, Volkswagen, some of the most successful ones. Then you had some Chinese brands, which really started getting more popular since the 90s, but really the 2000s. And this was the model for a very long time. But what was the characteristics of the Chinese automotive industry, which are relevant to today's conversation and continue to be quite important, is local support for the industry, so local government support for the industry, which has led to a lot of fragmentation in the industry. What I mean by that is that you tend to have a lot of small producers in the Chinese automotive industry, which aren't selling a lot of cars, but they kind of stay alive because they receive support from the local government. So that's sort of been, that was the situation throughout the 90s, the 2000s. Now, what has changed in recent years is that thanks to the rise of this new technology, electric vehicles, a lot of Chinese companies are doing very well without the need of foreign partners and are actually starting to reduce the market share of some of these foreign automakers. So you're really seeing head-to-head competition, which wasn't the case before. And in many cases, I think we're now seeing that these Chinese brands are producing also very competitive, attractive vehicles at a very competitive cost.
Thank you, Laurie. Maybe I should have started with this question, but if we could back up a bit, why should we care about China's auto industry? You mentioned electric vehicles. Why should we care about China's electric vehicles and what they're producing there?
Well, the automotive industry is quite important globally. It's a huge source of jobs globally. It's a big share of manufacturing. And the reason I think we tend to care about it is that actually a lot of manufacturing is concentrated in developed countries. So, you know, the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea, these are all big players when it comes to the automotive industry. So I think that's one reason why it matters quite a bit. China's industry matters. Well, China matters because it has a very big market. So it's quite important for international automakers. But then also what we're seeing now is that Chinese automakers are starting to go abroad and compete more directly with these automakers, not just in China, but also abroad. And EVs are all part of this because this is the technology of the future in many ways. And so right now in China, every year, the market penetration of electric vehicles, so the number of EVs that are sold relative to the overall number of vehicles, keeps growing and surpassing expectations. And that's been the case actually also in some other markets as well. The US is a little bit of a laggard compared to, for example, Europe, but here too, there's been a pickup since the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is like the next generation of vehicles. And that's why we care about it, is because it really may determine which companies succeed and consequently also which countries are going to continue to have a big role in auto manufacturing.
And in terms of the importance of EV beyond just the economic importance, I've also seen arguments about how it's important for environmental climate change, reducing dependence on foreign oil. How do you look at how China views this? Do they view EV as just purely from the economic importance, or do they also view it as having importance beyond the economic rationale for them?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking that, Bonnie. I mean, obviously, shifting to electric transportation would reduce emissions significantly. And I think, emissions from on-road transportation are quite significant. They're one of the number one causes of CO2 emissions in this country, for example. But in China, it's a little more complicated. If I can actually share my personal story, I wrote my dissertation on electric vehicle policy in China. And when I started looking at this, I was interested in environmental policy in China and climate policy. And so, I started looking at policies to reduce emissions from transportation. I started researching electric vehicles, and quickly I found that actually all the policymaking wasn't being made in the ministries that oversee climate or environmental policy, but by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and before that, the Ministry of Science and Technology. So it really was from the start, the policies to promote EVs in China were coming from the apparatus that oversees industrial policy and was really an industrial policy question. Now, in addition to that, I think it does certainly fit into a broader push within China towards decarbonization. And certainly, I think there are discussions in China about how this could benefit energy security because, of course, China is a big importer of oil. So that is also part of this discussion. But I think this gets to a broader point that in China, climate policy is intrinsically linked with economic policy. And so many of the clean tech industries that are core to meeting decarbonization goals and reducing emissions globally in China have been seen as export industries. They've been seen as new drivers of growth. And so they've received the same kind of subsidies that you might see for other industries like semiconductors, for example. And so I think now there's been a shift in the West, and not just the West, but around the world where a lot of other governments are thinking about these issues. But in China, I think this predates the conversation in the US, for example, by quite a few years.
Well, thank you, Ilaria. I know you've done quite a bit of work on not only electric vehicles, but also China's auto industry as a whole. And you recently published a CSIS report looking at China as the world's largest vehicle exporter. Could you unpack some of the details of this? How, from your perspective, has China been able to overtake historical powerhouses like Japan?
Yes, thank you, Bonnie, for the shout out. This was a report that I co-authored with Gregor Sebastian from Merix and is available on the CSIS website, where we really tried to unpack what was the drivers of China's EV export boom. So I would say there has been a significant uptick in exports, both of internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles. The internal combustion engine uptick, the growth has not been quite as large, but the numbers are pretty significant. And a big driver of that was actually Russia. So one big driver of the internal combustion engine export uptick was that as legacy automakers pulled out of Russia due to its invasion of Ukraine, Chinese automakers were able to fill in the void. So they've really sort of replaced a lot of the foreign automakers, from Korean automakers, Western automakers, etc. And so they've really taken advantage of that. So that explains in part, I think that's a big explainer from the internal combustion engines side of things. I actually think the electric vehicle side is much more interesting, and we've seen a more rapid growth. And just to give you a sense of the numbers here, exports of EVs in 2020 amounted to $2.5 billion. In 2022, it was $22.62 billion exports from China. So, that's a pretty significant increase. There's various reasons for that. One is that there's just more demand globally for electric vehicles. And the most significant destination for EVs is Europe, and there has been, very significant growth in demand for EVs. There is another reason that is that, on top of that, EVs from China are produced in China are quite competitive. And when I specify it's not just Chinese brands, it's also foreign automakers that are exploiting their manufacturing capacity in China to export globally. So what we found was that in the first half of 2023, almost 40% of exports of electric vehicles from China were Teslas. So I think that's just like a good reminder that we're not just talking here about Chinese brands, we're also talking about Western manufacturers that are producing in China and then exporting elsewhere. And this, I think, gets to some of the concerns in Europe, for example, over outsourcing, essentially.
That's a pretty shocking figure, Alara, that 40% of electric vehicles that were exported from China were Teslas. So are you saying, at least in the auto industry, in terms of electric vehicles, you're not seeing companies move away from China despite what's happening in terms of U.S. efforts to de-risk from China? You're actually seeing companies move towards China.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? And so I should specify that was exports from China to Europe, right? But Europe is the biggest market for Chinese EV exports. So it's complicated. A company like Tesla is obviously especially complicated, and I should note they're quite unique in a way because Tesla is the only company that has a wholly owned factory in China. So they're able to produce vehicles in China for the Chinese market and for the export market without a Chinese partner. So they are in some ways extremely invested in the Chinese market, and they are exploiting that manufacturing capacity that they have in China. And there are reports that they're trying to expand production in China as well. So we'll have to see exactly how that plays out, but it certainly doesn't seem like a company like Tesla is pulling out from China. When you look at other Western manufacturers, what you actually see is a bit of a split. Some companies are essentially pulling out of the Chinese market because they don't seem to be able to compete effectively and they see a lot of the global risk. Some companies like Stellantis, Ford to a certain extent. Well, instead, there's other companies like Volkswagen that have doubled down on their investments in China and are actually doing, now investing in Chinese companies to try and acquire their technology, which is quite a change, I think, compared to a few years ago.
And as these companies, whether they're Tesla or other foreign companies, as they're investing in China, what sorts of policies has the Chinese government taken to support either their development in China or China's electric auto industry as a whole?
Yes, that's a really good question. So there are a variety of tools that are available to the Chinese government at various levels to support manufacturing in general that have been deployed in the automotive sector and EVs in particular. So, there's obviously direct subsidy. Those are in a way are the easiest to quantify, although that's also quite complicated. But then there's quite a significant form of support through the financial sector, right? So the availability of credit to companies that might not necessarily qualify for credit or concessionary loans at lower rates, for example. So that's quite present as well. There's also often local governments provide a variety of types of incentives. They might provide tax breaks for companies that set up a factory locally. They may be able to provide land at a preferential rate or even essentially very low cost. They may be able to provide assurance that, maybe even informally, assurance that these companies will win procurement contracts, right? So some of these are very hard to track and some of them are a little easier to prove. But on the whole, there has been a lot of support. Another really important one that I should note is essentially injections of equity from the government. There are these so-called government guidance funds in China, which are quite important in providing support for strategic industries. They've been crucial for the semiconductor industry in China, but they have played quite an important role in the automotive sector as well. So they have been able to provide capital to companies in moments in which they needed it. And NIO is one company that's benefited significantly from this in the past.
And do foreign automakers enjoy these same benefits, or are there additional restrictions that apply to them to create more advantage for domestic Chinese automakers?
They have benefited from these. Now, exactly how much relative to Chinese companies is, as I said, hard to quantify. But we know that Tesla, for example, has benefited from several of these instruments and that it received a lot of benefits through the government of Shanghai.
Great, thank you. I did want to follow up a little bit more with what you mentioned earlier, which is how Chinese EV brands are doing. I think you mentioned or suggested earlier that some of them are doing quite well. But on a whole, are they as competitive as leading foreign brands like Tesla?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's difficult in a way to evaluate exactly how this is going to play out in the long term. But right now, I think the Chinese market provides a pretty good indication. So Tesla does very well in China. But other automakers have struggled, especially their EVs have struggled to compete with EVs produced by Chinese companies. And part of the reason for that is that it does require sort of a company culture shift in the way in which companies think about cars. The software is really important. The type of digital products that come with the vehicle are really important. The battery is the component with the most value added in the vehicle. So if you are not producing that in-house, you're losing a big chunk of the value added, essentially. So a company that can take more advantage of the cost reductions that come from producing the battery in-house. So a company like BYD is very highly vertically integrated, for example. Tesla, to a certain extent, is fairly integrated. Companies like Volkswagen have not really had that advantage. So I think you actually see that in the Chinese market, where consumers actually used to really like Western cars or foreign cars, Volkswagen was extremely popular in China, have all shifted to Chinese brands or Tesla when it comes to electric vehicles, because they're essentially seeing that the product may not even be as good from foreign automakers. The price is cheaper from Chinese brands. And so there's really no reason why they would pick a foreign brand when they could pick a Chinese one. So I think that's indicative, basically, of how competitive these cars are. Now, we're going to have to see exactly how this plays out in the global markets, but I think we have some indications as well in some countries where Chinese car makers are now exporting or even, starting to plan production, that they could be quite successful and can compete very effectively, at least in the electric vehicle space, with other automakers.
So I have a couple of follow-on questions there, but maybe I'll just start with one right now and then circle back. So you mentioned that Chinese brands, at least in China, are becoming more popular than foreign brands like Volkswagen. What are some examples of the top Chinese brands? And broadly speaking, are there several leading Chinese brands in electric vehicle, or is there a lot more branding and a lot more choice for Chinese customers?
Yes. So, right now, if you're thinking of buying an electric vehicle anywhere in the world, the place where you'd have the most choice is China. And that's because automakers have been developing electric vehicles for a much longer time. And so you also have much more choice in terms of price. So there's just much more availability of lower cost or mid-range cost vehicles compared to, for example, the United States. Now, in terms of brands, I would say BYD is by far the best-selling electric vehicle in China, and they are starting to be more and more successful internationally as well. They're quite an impressive company, actually. But I did mention earlier about the automotive industry in China more broadly, that it was highly fragmented, so you tended to have a lot of companies, maybe some of which were not selling as many vehicles. That applies to the EV sector as well. We've had a bit of a weeding out of some of these EV makers over the years, but there's still a very large number. And I think the majority of these car makers aren't actually producing a lot of vehicles, or very successful ones. But there's quite a few impressive companies that are providing actually interesting products to consumers at the moment.
And how many of these different EV companies are actually focused on the Chinese domestic market versus venturing abroad? So for example, if you're looking at the United States, how much headway are Chinese EVs making here?
So the United States may be the worst example in some ways, because we really don't see many Chinese exports to the United States at the moment. There is one, as far as I know, there's only one company that is exporting electric vehicles from China to the United States. That's Polestar, which is a joint venture between Volvo and Geely. And Volvo also is owned by Geely, so it is essentially fully Chinese owned. They are actually scheduled to start producing in the United States soon. And Volvo, of course, produces in the United States, so they do have a factory already. But that's kind of unique. There are no other companies that are exporting to the United States, and that's because of the tariffs. So the tariffs are quite high right now. It is 27.5%. That's because of the tariffs that were introduced during the Trump era. So in a way, that's insulated the American market from Chinese EV exports. Now, getting to your question of how many Chinese companies are producing for the domestic market, well, I'd say initially initially, I think most car makers in China were focused on the domestic market. It is by far the largest market for electric vehicles. 60% of all EVs sold last year were sold in China, and almost half of all EVs on the roads right now are in China. So both historically and currently, it is the largest market. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of car makers and there's a lot of choice. And currently, there's also been a bit of a price war. So there's a lot of competition in China. So car makers that exit China find and go to other markets, they have less competition. They have the opportunity of establishing themselves fairly early on in a new developing market, which means that they can establish brand loyalty, etc. And in some cases, these automakers also have boards they respond to that are also pressuring them to internationalize. So I think there's like various reasons why these car makers are going abroad, but I think all the incentives are there for more and more of these Chinese car makers to move internationally, especially given also that the Chinese economy isn't doing super well at the moment.
So, Larry, you mentioned earlier Europe and how well they are doing in Europe and to some extent. So you mentioned that they're not making too much headway in the United States. So is Europe the main area where you're seeing the most headway, or are you also seeing a significant international push beyond, for example, the advanced developed countries to for other countries in the developing world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So right now, I would say the vast majority of exports from China are going to Europe. But there are some new growing markets. So when we looked at the data, I would say Asia was the second largest destination for EV exports from China. Southeast Asia is growing quite fast. In the report, we looked at planned production by Chinese automakers in Thailand, which is already an automotive hub and is now working. The government has been actually quite proactive about both promoting EV sales domestically, but also attracting EV manufacturing. So there's several Chinese companies that are setting up factories in Thailand for the Thai market, but also probably, we'll see exactly, but probably to export to the region more broadly. So I think that points to the potential growth in certain other regions. There's always an open question about Latin America. There's a couple of Chinese car makers, BYD is one of them, that are setting up factories in Brazil. These, again, would probably be aiming to produce for the region as well as the domestic market. It's a little more complicated because Brazil actually doesn't have a very strong EV market, so it's a bit of a bet, I'd say, but there's obviously there's probably going to be growing demand there in the region in Latin America as well. And of course, Chinese internal combustion engine makers have exported to the developing world for a very long time. So they have strong exports towards the global south, South America, Africa, and Asia, of course. So, there is that existing trade relationship.
Thank you. This question may be a little bit left field, but as you know, there's been reports about how China has banned or limited the use of Tesla for China's military and government employees because of concerns of what might be recorded, what might be tracked within Tesla. Do you see, as China's venturing abroad with its EV vehicles, whether that's in Europe, United States, or elsewhere, any similar concerns about the use of Chinese electric vehicles and the same security concerns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is that when we're talking about electric vehicles, we're all focusing on the battery, right? On the actual, the powertrain, why, the electric side of things. But actually what's happening is that many of these vehicles are really high tech in the sense they're very connected. They're basically computers on wheels, right? And they're collecting a lot of data. And so I think there is a real question about where does that data go? How is it managed? Do we have the right types of regimes, regulatory regimes, to deal with that? And I think that's going to be increasingly important in general. But of course, with Chinese companies, that becomes a bigger question because of issues over transparency and also potential concerns, security concerns over potentially data that gets transferred to China. So I think that's part of a broader question, to be honest, about also how to think about Chinese companies as they internationalize, especially in a lot of these sort of high-tech industries. And I think a lot of governments are just going to have to think more deeply about some of these issues and also perhaps more creatively.
One final question I want to ask on this segment before transitioning to a related topic is you mentioned that electric batteries are the component with the most value added in terms of electric vehicles produced by China. There's also been significant reporting on how China is the main source of competitively priced EV batteries. What type of advantage does that give China in terms of producing these vehicles?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and actually, I should note that we don't see a lot of exports of Chinese EVs to the U.S., but we are seeing certain companies investing in trying to either build factories, battery factories in the United States, or collaborating with U.S. car makers, most notably Ford and CATL, to produce batteries. And I think that's going to be a recurring headache, I think, here in Washington, because Chinese battery makers are some of the most important producers of these technologies globally, and they have the technology to produce some of these batteries quite cheaply. There's several questions involved in this. There's several issues in this. One is the actual production of the battery. Another one is the components that go into the battery. So China is also a big producer of cathodes and anodes, which of course are needed to produce the batteries. China is also a huge refiner of critical minerals. They're necessary for the production of a variety of technologies, actually, as your program, the China Power, has written about in the past. But this is particularly important for batteries, certainly with lithium, for example. And Chinese companies are also very much involved in the mining, which may not happen in China, but the Chinese companies are involved overseas. So I think there's several different related policy questions there, which already are being discussed very actively here in Washington and in other places around the world, certainly in Europe at the moment. And I think it really raises some of these dilemmas where you do want to have access to the cheapest, most effective technology to reduce emissions, for example, and to ensure that also, car makers, American car makers in some cases, have access to components that are effective and low cost. But you also want to ensure that there are reliable, resilient supply chains. There's a diversified supply chain, that there are no strangleholds, right? So I think there's a bit of that's, I think, at the heart of the dilemma right now.
Great, thank you. I think that's a good transition to talk about the implications of China's EV industry, what it's doing in terms of exports abroad, and what are the implications of that for U.S. policymakers, but also policy within some of our key allies and partners. As you look at China's rapid rise, particularly in the global auto sector, we're also seeing, for example, the European Commission launching an investigation into whether it wants to impose punitive tariffs to protect European producers. What is your best advice as you look at from the U.S. government perspective or perspective of our European colleagues? How should we deal with China's growing dominant EV industry, and what are recommendations that you have for policymakers?
Thank you. Not easy, right? I think the real issue here is that the first instinct is to introduce tariffs and protect the domestic industry. And that's, I think, as I said, right, that's in partly insulated the United States until now. But what the danger there is that the domestic industry isn't exposed to competition. And so it's not producing those low-cost desirable vehicles that will be competitive in the export markets, right? So I think in a way, when we look at what's been done so far, we've seen that these companies, these legacy automakers in the US or Europe or elsewhere, that really haven't invested significantly in the electric vehicle technology, and in some cases actually lobbied against it. And so the result has been that these companies have been very unprepared as consumers have picked up and increased their demand for EVs, as well as, governments providing more incentives because of decarbonization goals. So I think that creates a really challenging policy environment. I would say my main advice is not to try and reverse the transition towards electric vehicles and to continue to provide incentives to companies to be very innovative. So the danger here is that governments may introduce tariffs, which is the U.S., of course, has tariffs right now, and the European Union may eventually introduce tariffs as a result of this ongoing investigation, may introduce tariffs which may protect domestic producers to a certain extent, but then they will also be insulated from competition and will produce vehicles that essentially nobody will want to buy when they go and export to other markets where Chinese automakers are also present. I think this also highlights the challenge right now where car makers that are pulling out of China are also pulling out of the most most competitive and dynamic market for automotive market. And so you do actually want car makers somewhat involved in that conversation and that very dynamic environment that is China right now in order to then tap into that and be able to produce competitive vehicles. So I think that makes it really complicated for policymakers to balance all these different issues. And I think that's going to be the challenge for the European Commission in the next few months as they investigate the subsidies that certainly have been provided to car makers in China and try to think how they can ensure that European industrial production remains competitive.
And do we also have to do more on the whole, supply chain to support the production of electric vehicles? You were mentioning, for example, critical minerals. You were mentioning the various components that go into an electric vehicle. What could or should the United States or our European allies and partners do on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's conversations about this and there's legislation on this, both in the U.S. and the European Union, right? Of course, Inflation Reduction Act has a lot targeting critical minerals and really tries to incentivize both the diversification of supply chains, but also reshoring to a certain extent. In Europe right now, we have the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Minerals Act, which are also trying to ensure that Europe has access to a fairly diversified and secure supply chain. These are complicated issues. It's going to be very complicated to actually ensure that these supply chains are available in the short term, and also that there is no involvement of Chinese companies, just because these value chains have been so interconnected. I think it's just worth keeping in mind that just like with a lot of other technologies that have developed over the past 20 years, these are the product of highly integrated, globalized supply chains. And so when we now try and sort of disentangle how interconnected companies are for legitimate reasons in some cases, it does make it a little complicated. It is a bit of an experiment in terms of what the cost is eventually going to be as well. So I do think that one of the questions that will have to be answered is actually how much Chinese involvement in these supply chains is going to be acceptable. And by that, I mean not just production in China, but also there's a lot of these Chinese companies are internationalizing and are investing more and more internationally. And so I think also trying to think through what is an acceptable level of exposure to Chinese firms is going to be really important. I think different countries are thinking about this differently. The U.S. has a much lower risk tolerance on this compared to some of its partners, including the European Union. But I do think that this is going to be a very important issue. I think right now, the next step in the United States is actually, we're all waiting for an entity of concern definition to be issued by the Treasury or be clarified by the Department of Treasury for the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's going to determine which companies can qualify for tax credits for batteries issued in the United States.